Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for an evening with author Katherine Standefer. My name is Megan, and I'm the Programs and Exhibit Supervisor at the Arlington Heights Memorial Library, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Joan and Natalie, who will be helping us out tonight. And now I'm going to turn it on over to Joan.
Hello, welcome everybody. We are so pleased to have here in our studios our guest tonight, Katherine Standefer. Katherine is an Arlington Heights native and a graduate of John Hersey High School. So it's wonderful to have her back in town, and we're so pleased to be able to support her in this and have her as our guest. Her riveting, well-written debut memoir, Lightning Flowers, is getting rave reviews from all over, the New York Times and Kirkus, to name a few. She's been interviewed on NPR's Fresh Air, as well as other places. This book was shortlisted for the Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Prize from Columbia Graduate School of Journalism and the Nieman Foundation at Harvard. Her writing was in the Best American Essays of 2016. In 2018, she was a Logan Nonfiction Fellow at the Carey Institute for Global Good. She earned her MFA in Nonfiction at the University of Arizona and teaches for Ashland University's low residency MFA program. She writes from a juniper-studded mesa in New Mexico. She lives happily with her chickens. So I'm going to turn this over to you, Kati, and we'll be back for the Q&A.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you as well for actually having me. This is a virtual event, but it is the first event where I am in the place that I am speaking to. I'm actually at Arlington Heights Memorial Library, which is a big treat because this is where I grew up reading. Some of you know that I was a kid in some iteration of this building, although of course it's changed a lot, doing the summer reading passport programs and just losing myself in the stack. So it's incredibly exciting to get to be here and to be embraced by you all in my home community. Without further ado, I'm just going to dive in. I know some of you have had a chance to read Lightning Flowers and some of you haven't. Lightning Flowers is a book that tells the story of my troubled relationship to my own implanted cardiac defibrillator, which is a device that should be life-saving and often is life-saving, but which has been much more complicated in my experience. And the book tells not only my own story, but the story of my sister. We both share the same genetic condition called long QT syndrome. And I'm gonna read a little bit from the book right at the beginning, because I feel like this is a great place to kick off, knowing what a wide-ranging conversation Joan and Megan and I may get to have. I should say that part of what makes the implanted cardiac defibrillator complex is not only what it's like to have it in your body, but the way it connects you to this particular healthcare system and the way it connects you to the places that the resources in it came from all over the world. And so the prologue really kicks us off into the question that the book holds most closely. So this is from the prologue, Tucson, Arizona, 2012. Nothing can prepare you for what it feels like to be shocked by an implanted cardioverter defibrillator. Like a badly spliced film reel, my memory of the night is fractured. In one instant, a player on the other intramural soccer team had fallen and the game stopped. He was getting up, brushing his thighs. In the next, my hands became claws. A maul cracked open my chest with a sickening thump, a hot whip tearing through my back. Did somebody kick in my spine? And then I knew, and I was screaming. There's no way you wouldn't scream if you felt it, my sister had said. By then, the defibrillator had been in my body for 3 silent years, resting loyally above my left breast, keeping watch for the arrhythmia that could send me to the ground unconscious, with a heart quivering rather than pumping blood. Now, on a crisp November night in Tucson, Arizona, I dropped to my knees in time to take the second shock. What if it doesn't stop? I knew something was wrong, either with my device or with my body, but probably my ICD. If it was an arrhythmia, I should have been collapsed, unconscious, not sharp and alive like this, staring at the backs of houses at the edge of the field, their kitchen lights spilling dully out the windows as I screamed. Call 911! A third shock. You can either scream or breathe, a voice inside me said. and I began to pull in air, cold, heavy breaths, the way I'd learned to breathe into pain in yoga. I am either alive or dead, and I choose which. The device did not fire again. Can I get someone behind me? I called out. I don't trust myself not to fall. Someone cupped my back immediately, supported me to the ground, and the sky came into view. A ring of faces, the sharp white field lights, the smell of burning, which was me. There is a kind of dream state that settles over the body in these moments, a clarity that rarely visits us when our lives are busy unfolding. For lying on my back, looking at the stars, a question lodged itself in my brain, a wild constellation of if-then statements. If the defibrillator just saved my life, if a defibrillator is just metal, if metal is mined earth, if children sometimes work in mines, if tunnels collapse, if warlords profit, if women are raped, if mountains are dismantled and made toxic, if mined earth just saved my life, was it worth it? The thin branched burns that uncoil from the heads and necks of lightning strike victims are sometimes called lightning flowers. Fern-like, following the patterns of rain or sweat, they are rose-colored lightning bolts frozen onto the body, as beautiful as they are terrible. I will never know what my insides looked like after 2,000 volts, if my tissues erupted into lightning flowers of the body cavity, a sudden bloom. What I do know is that the night I took 3 shocks to the heart, I was marked, called into the world in a way I could not turn away from. What can save us, I would learn, never comes without cost. Some people say lightning strikes cure blindness. This is my version. And I'm just going to read a little bit from the middle of the book as well. That opening prologue sort of initiates both halves of this book. This is a book that's pretty rangy in what it tries to accomplish. It tells the story of my own experience waking up in a parking lot with gravel in my forehead at age 24, learning I have this heart condition and having to change my life in order to potentially save my own life. And it follows my journey through the American healthcare system. But the book also follows my journey across the world to understand where those resources inside the device come from, as I talk about in that prologue. And so I'm going to read a little bit from chapter 5, which is one of these supply chain chapters. And it takes place in Muramanga, Madagascar, in 2014. Outside the boomtown of Muramanga, the hills pushed up like long grassy shoulder blades. It was winter in the southern hemisphere, winter in the highlands of Madagascar. In the flat places at the base of the hills, rice paddies gleamed green. Above them, old men, barefoot, urged zebu up steep bridges. Women carried mahampi baskets on their heads. My guide, Anja, and I had met at the mining company's interpretive center in town. And now we drove up the long red road toward the nickel and cobalt pit in a jostling company truck. The clouds hung low and dark, light bursting between their cracks, a kind of chest-aching beautiful. The mine was young. On the day I visited, it had been in production for only 5 months, although 7 years had elapsed since construction began. Mineral exploration at the deposit dated back to 1960. Companies kept handing the project off to one another, until finally in 2006, the government finalized its environmental impact assessment and issued permits to Ambatuli, a joint venture between South Korean, Japanese, and Canadian mining companies, and the largest ever foreign investment on the island. Expected to produce 60,000 tons of refined nickel, 5,600 tons of cobalt, and 210,000 tons of ammonium sulfate, a fertilizer. The mine required the removal of a village and the dismantling of a forest ecosystem, home to endangered species found nowhere else in the world. I had cobalt in my battery, nickel in my microelectronics. If it wasn't yet, this was about to be the largest lateritic nickel mine in the world. Lateritic meaning weathered rock, meaning limestone, sandstone, or clay, leaching over time into the ground as water percolated, leaving behind what was less soluble, nickel, cobalt, iron, copper. The ore was soft, permeable. 2 separate deposits draped across 1,600 hectares, nearly 3,000 football fields. each 20 to 100 meters deep. Bulldozers removed overburden with their swooped noses. Articulated haul trucks shuttled the red dirt to the ore preparation plant. For every 1,000 kilograms of red earth at this mine, there lay 10 kilograms of nickel and a single kilogram of cobalt. When it rained, the soft earth ran downhill off the road and clogged the rice paddies. The company knew a certain amount of this was inevitable. They paid the farmers when it happened. It was in the budget. To make a road cut was to release the earth, to make a wound that would not reliably stop leaking. Some of the farmers were relocated because of the road, because of their ruined rice paddies. For others, the company held zebu sacrifices, where they drank rum together. It was in the budget. When I heard these stories, I wondered whom they sent on behalf of the corporation to bring the zebu, to drink the rum, to watch the gullet split. The road climbed. Now greenery, tangled and tall, began to mount on the roadsides. Suddenly we had left the long silver hills for a dense, wet world. Lemur bridges arced over the road. The canopy cut the light. Everything was splattered with red mud. The trucks passing through all day sent up tightened clouds of dust, truck after truck after truck. Company biologists counted the lemurs, Anja told me. They knew how many crossed the bridges. Sifakas with their black faces and white fluffy heads. Indris with their tufted ears and fierce eyes and little opposable thumbs. Some tagged with radio collars. The biologists tracked how many crossed the bridges and charted which tree hollows the lemurs used. They held the soft primates in their arms to bloodlet them so they could monitor their health. When the forest came down, they left it half chopped to give the animals time to leave. A compassionate pause. The machines cut. Wait. Cut. Wait. Their engines, a roar of warning. When the bulldozers finally came, the biologists manually salvaged any lemurs who had not left. To manually salvage was to knock at the tree like a house guest, to scoop lemurs from the wreckage. They hoped the lemurs would use the bridges. They hoped the lemurs would use the protected forest corridor, which would deliver them to Andasibe Mantadia National Park, or the forest known as Ankarana, where they could find a new home. In the company's plan, there would be no net loss. A truck drove by spraying water. Dust control, Anja said. One cannot open the red heart of a mountain and expect it will not bleed. And that's just a little taste. So I think Joan and I are gonna dive in a little bit deeper. Thank you, everyone.
Well, both of those explain why I tell everybody this reads like a thriller. You know, read this book, you tell people about it, and I tell everybody, you have to read this. It reads like a thriller, because when I tell you I read it in 2 nights, I was tearing through it. Because in between those two things, or not in between, I should say, before that moment, you begin the book so riveting with that story of you getting the shocks. What happened was when you did get the notification that you really had to get this done, in a matter of 5 days, you had to leave everything behind. You were living in Wyoming, in a small cabin, right? And you had to establish residency to assist in your care and insurance. Obviously, things were challenging, income, insurance, and living in Montana. Can you address, that's quite a big compelling part of the story too, is having to uproot everything in 5 days and go set up residency in Colorado.
Yeah, that's a big part of the story. So when I passed out in the parking lot, I was 24 and actually living in Wyoming. And I was uninsured at the time, and the year was 2009. And so the Affordable Care Act had not yet been passed. And it was, in fact, the summer that the healthcare debates were really raging. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is just the bizarre experience of listening to politicians on the radio argue why things like the pre-existing conditions rule, which allowed insurance companies to not insure people, or at least the specific conditions that people had before they signed on. And, you know, I was 24, and I think, you know, there's, in one sense, accountability of like, you let your temporary insurance plan lapse. That, you know, they were sort of those very skinny insurance plans on the market back then that were really just for catastrophic care. They didn't really contribute to your health at all because they had such large deductibles and they had pretty high premiums. And so it is true that, at some point I couldn't afford that plan and let it lapse. And also, I think we can remember what it's like to be 24. And I think there have always been a lot of Americans who can't afford health insurance on the private market. And this moment of learning that I have a condition, so I didn't explain in depth, but long QT syndrome is a genetic electrical abnormality that our type of long QT relates to the stress response in the body, the adrenaline startle response. And so my younger sister started going into cardiac arrest in her dorm room when her roommate's alarm clock would go off. And I went down in a parking lot because a phone rang. So this is not really preventable, right? The sound of an ambulance could be what kills us. And so this idea of being left without care and without routes to care, and just the sheer brainstorming that my family did of like, can you get a job that has insurance? And, I had applied for some, but the year was 2009. Again, we're in financial downturn. I was sort of a college student who was working in outdoor education. And so I didn't have a lot of qualifications for the types of jobs that correlated to insurance. And we were looking at like, within the healthcare debates, could you be someone's darling and sort of like get publicity as an uninsured person and somehow gain help? I mean, we really were spitballing all over the place. And in the end, that the answer was my younger sister's surgeon, who was in Boulder, Colorado, said he would donate his fee if I could do the surgery at his hospital. And they were estimating the surgery out of pocket at $180,000 at that time, which is part of uninsured people actually being charged higher rates than insured folks who have the benefit of like negotiated down rates that insurance companies access. And so this surgeon said he would help me. He also said Colorado had better social services if you could prove that you needed them. And so, yeah, I quit my life. I moved to Boulder. I began the process of establishing residency. And I thought I would die every minute of every day. And that was sort of our Hail Mary for accessing surgery. And in the end, I did go in through the ER one night when I had terrible chest pains, and that surgeon also got the anesthesiologist to donate his fee, and he got St. Jude Medical, the device manufacturer, to donate a device, which now I know from my research was probably, getting close to its expiration date, and they needed to make sure it went in a body anyway. But great to benefit from that pool. And then Boulder Community Hospital ended up chipping in about $87,000. And we paid probably $20,000 or $30,000 out of pocket with all costs involved. So yeah, what a wacky way to seek healthcare.
Well, and in that story in Colorado, we're just between looking for apartments and trying to get who wasn't there over a holiday weekend to get the security deposit and things, but also you needing to. Didn't someone almost tell you to kind of fake a heart attack because your timing had to be perfect, and it ended up thankfully happening oddly. You didn't have a heart attack, but that you were not feeling well and went in anyway.
It was quite bizarre.
Yeah, that particular passage had me, I just couldn't even believe it.
Yeah.
Everything.
I think the overwhelming feeling of that part of my life and that part of the book is really centered on this question of what is it that makes our lives and what makes our lives worth living? And for me, it wasn't that I wanted to die from this heart defect, obviously. I was terrified. But in the process of quitting this life that I built in Wyoming, which folks who read the book know that I spent my entire life just idolizing this geographic area, that ecosystem, those forests, I finally made it there. I was living this life that was very grounded into that land and spiritually informed by it. And to have to quit all my jobs and leave my partner behind and just really not know what kind of job I might end up working as part of gaining residency. It was truly like, wait, but who am I? If I can't do all these things I love and I'm uprooted from these places and things I love, like, what is my life? And then in the longer I sort of had to wait to know what it might look like, I think this is something that we all just lived through together in the pandemic, like when the calendar collapses, when we just want to know something about a few days from now, a few weeks from now? Like, how do I anchor myself? And there's one scene in the book in which I become quite suicidal in a hotel room, which is kind of a bizarre thing because I'm trying to save my life by going to get this surgery. But the way I write it is the answer to the threat of death was death. It's like, if this uncertainty is so unbearable, maybe I don't have a life anymore to save, which, you know, wasn't logic that ultimately I followed, and I'm grateful for that. And I actually just yesterday got to sign books at the Boulder bookstore, which plays sort of a pivotal role in that scene. But I think I really, in writing that section, had to probe into like, why was that time so fraught? And it was just like, I think any of us, when we face a life-threatening diagnosis, are not going to know how to govern our own lives suddenly, but especially to be 24 and have that be so. And yeah, there's a point I reached that I'm just like, we need to just do this now, because I can't, I can't do this anymore. And a nurse does advise me to fake cardiac arrest and tells me if I go in through the ER, that's where I'll get the most support. And I think that was sort of a well-known open secret in many ways back in the pre-Affordable Care Act days, that like the ER had to treat you, and the ER generated most of its financial aid toward those who came in through the ER. But I felt very unsure whether or not I should actually do that. And it was very eerie to lie down one night and have those chest pains on the exact day we've been talking about faking the event. And so I'm grateful that I didn't have to fake the event, but that also made it scarier, right?
Exactly, because now you're being forced, not only are decisions being taken away from you, but now you're being forced to make a decision that doesn't feel comfortable for you.
Yeah.
I know one of the early quotes you do say is, how is a person to live if she were simultaneously fine and in danger at every moment?
Yes.
And so much of this book, I felt that in you when you were traveling on a plane and you can hear the buzzing of, as your battery was going low and you're going on the way to Bogota, Colombia, and
feel it on my pectoral.
Yeah. So you're alive and in danger at the same moment. So I do want to talk about that, the travel and during all this, you did, I think, at least live your life after the decisions were taken from you. You did start living your life back on the terms you wanted. You were traveling to places that made me nervous. I knew in Africa, where there's 5 cardiologists in the entire region. But I just want to know, when you look back on that, was that a saving grace for you, those travels and making those decisions for yourself, that you're going to do it no matter what?
Yeah, there's really 2 levels to that. And I think one piece is beautifully a part of the fact that I'm at my childhood library right now, and with my father. My dad started reading me The Hobbit in kindergarten, and we read the whole Lord of the Rings series in my early grade school years. And so I really did grow up, and some of this is disposition, the way I latched onto it, but I really grew up with this sense of like the adventure of things and the meaningful journey, and that being of importance. And that this was like obviously something that a life would contain, which I think what I discovered in my own story is also true when you like actually pause for a moment to look at something like Lord of the Rings. You have characters who we are able to sort of like look in on their adventures and be like so moved by it and feel the swell of the music and feel the full arc of it. And for them, it's a burden and it's terrifying. And both of those, I think, were present for me. So yeah, two of the things that happened after I had my first implanted cardiac defibrillator placed were that I went septic and almost died, which I talk about in the book. And then that I took those shocks to the heart, which I read about in the prologue. And so things had really changed in my body where I understood that literally everything we do carries risk, that even the most mundane activities, and COVID really like pulled back this veil for a lot more people, right? To go to the post office was suddenly dangerous. And going to the post office always contained the potential that you could have some random seizure or get in a car accident. I don't mean to like catastrophize and give folks nightmares, but truly to be human and to be alive is to be subject to that. But for me, it was so grounded and awake in my consciousness. It was like, well, like if death is possible all the time, and even placing an ICD might not save my life, if the ICD could do more harm than good, but also something else could kill me that's not controllable by the ICD, I just had that real embodied knowledge. And so honoring other knowledge in my body, like the pull that this trip was the right thing to do, that I was asking the right question and should follow it, that became much easier. And I was sort of frustrated along the way. I was a grad student when I went to Madagascar and South Africa, which is chapters, 5, 6, 11, and maybe part of 12 in the book. So I was in a period of my health that was a little bit more stable. I was also in a period of my life where I could have maybe gotten institutional funding for some things, and I mostly didn't get the grants I applied for. I think people looked at this project and they were like, this is way too ambitious for a grad student, and I don't know, maybe kind of wacky. Like I don't know what those grant meetings look like, but I know that I ended up running a Kickstarter project that many people in this community were a part of. We raised $17,000 in 20 days so that I could do this journey. And there was something about not getting the grants that made me feel like, if I'm not supposed to do this, if this is like not the correct choice for me, something in me will sort of collapse and give up. And instead, that piece inside me really like became more fierce. And so I think what you're saying is right, that when we are aware of the preciousness of our lives, we have a lot less room to mess around. We really become connected with this sense of like, what parts of my life are really my life, are really the things that are calling to me, like me authentically, the way I'm built. What is it the world needs from me? And there are a lot of complications to that, of course. That's like not a simple thing to do. But for me, holding this question, the way it obsessed me, and this question being like, how should I think about my life being saved by a device that costs quite a lot ecologically and socially to make? That just felt like a kind of true north that I couldn't ignore because of the relationship all these experiences created in my body.
That was amazing. And that the chapter on sepsis, when I've read the book a couple times, and it's just painful to get through because once again, all the control was taken out of your hands. And that was, I can't imagine, but you explain it in a way that, we're living through the story. And I was inspired by the fact that you continued to make those choices for yourself because so many were being taken from you. So I found that inspiring. But I do want to go back to I know you told Brooke Constable this, and I've read it in other interviews of yours about that. When you were 7 years old, you told your parents, "Mom, I'm going to be a writer in Wyoming, not Montana." And I just want you to talk about that passion that you had. Like, not a lot of 7-year-olds think like that, or even know that writing, that you can be a writer, or that can be something you can do, let alone move off to Wyoming. So can you talk about some of your early influences in that and what created Kati? Like you had just said, that's who you are in your DNA. I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, absolutely. As I was mentioning before, I really benefited from my parents loving reading and prioritizing reading. And I think recognizing what it was to me and going with that. And I don't think I ever in my younger years felt like, being a writer was somehow not a valid occupation. And I think some of it, maybe it was easier for my parents because I won a lot of awards pretty early in my life, Young Authors Awards at Olive Mary Stitt School, and poetry competitions through St. Writers when I was at Thomas. And so there was sort of that like natural glint of talent there. But I think a lot of us, I should say not everybody is is obligated to a lifetime that is dictated by passion, right? There are a lot of different types of people on the planet. There are a lot of people here to do different things and serve in different ways, and that's really valid. And I'm really interested both in my relationship to myself and my relationship to like my students or other people I'm working with. Like, how are we built? And how does the way we're built show us what we're for? And what are the things that were easier for us in life and sort of like unburdened and joyful? And I can say that, I would stay up all night writing these novels in middle school. There was something in me that knew I needed to kind of be alone. And in a family of 5, you're not usually alone in the house a lot. And I loved Midwestern thunderstorms. And so especially May, June, July, like this time of year, yeah, I would just stay up really late and just have these giant documents. And I was really facilitated in that along the way by a lot of teachers who I think recognized that my aptitude was like maybe not normal and who would let me go right in the hallway. I would get a list of spelling words where you needed to write a sentence for each one, and I would like build an entire newspaper around them. It was a little elaborate, and they gave me room to just like have the creativity I needed to have. And there was sort of a muddiness for a while that I remember in middle school and early high school, because I'm a little bit of a Da Vinci. I loved performing. I was a singer. I wrote songs, and I was an athlete. And at some point, it was actually on one of my first backpacking trips in Wyoming. I kind of had this moment. I had some cycles in which I didn't make the play. I had some great moments sort of being the captain of the soccer team, and then I'd had a season that really wasn't as good. I really was not excelling. And I think I was in the wilderness by this lake in the Wyoming range called Lake Alice. And I remember journaling about how no matter what other talents I was using or whatever I was interested in, I was sort of a writer at the heart of it. I was going to write about those other things. And that is why I don't have a degree in public health or a degree in international relations, right? I can do everything I need to as a writer, as a curious brain who is intent upon making poetry from the world around me. And from that moment on, I really said, like, I'm going to prioritize this. So I quit soccer. I took my senior year at Hersey High School. I took 6.5 years equivalents of English within the 8 periods a day. I just like took all writing classes and did not take any more math. And I just think about, some of you have probably heard Malcolm Gladwell talk about the 10,000 hours and how if we want to be truly great at something, it just takes a lot of practice, a lot of time, and that not all practice is equal. You need to like be focused in a certain way and be working with teachers or masters for some of it, to have an awareness of what needs to proceed rather than just what needs to develop, rather than just sort of like repeating the same bad habits. And I just feel like I got in so many hours of my time in elementary school and middle school and high school. And by the time I got to college, I was really having fun, sort of flexing my muscles around what might be. And so, this book is interesting because it took 8 years to write from the time I got shocked to the heart to publication date. If you look at like when I passed out in a parking lot, then it's more like 11 years, some of that journaling that's in the book. But it's hard for me to not view this book as the product of the lifetime of work and all of the collective support that enabled me to really develop a voice and study a craft. And we'll just see like what book number 2 looks like, if it feels that same way, or if it's a little bit like crisper at the edges, because it didn't have like 36 years of buildup.
Well, you did talk about the fact that it's a 2-parter. It's obviously actual with finding that global supply chain that you had obviously been interested in even before this all happened. And then, of course, just the odyssey through the healthcare system. And I know you've helped people with this book because I've heard it myself just in town, and that of people who have this or have gone through this. And I'm going to imagine you've had people walk up to you at many different things and tell you their stories. So when did you know you needed to write this and get this message out? Like when in this process, or was it journal anyway? Or when were you like, I have to share the story, not for selfish purposes, but really to show the world?
Yeah, it's a great question. I was already enough of a serious writer and knew I was trying to build a career as a writer when I passed out that I understood immediately that I was living something insane that would get written about. I was a double major in college, fiction writing and sociology, and I'd been a poet throughout, middle and high school. So you can really see in the book the way that more rigorous research brain and theoretical brain meet dialogue and character building. So I think I assumed I would write it as fiction because that's what I was working on at the time, novels, novellas, short stories. And that nonfiction bent was definitely in me, and I was reading a lot of environmental writers who were writing personal essays and publishing memoirs. So it was sort of simmering. And what happened was that I journaled through a lot of it. There definitely were blank parts where I was just too busy, too out of my mind to be writing a lot. But there's also a lot of this book where I've just quit my whole life, so I don't have a lot to do. And I very much understood that like every note I could take then was gold. And also that there's nothing better for my mental health than writing. If I'm not writing, I'm usually not doing pretty well. So I did take a lot of notes in my journal. Entire paragraphs that I wrote in 2009 and 2010 have been lifted into the book. But what happened after I recovered from sepsis and after my partner Sam left, which is sort of the end of part one, I took this continuing education class in Boulder at the university that was fiction. And I just saw how I was trying so hard to turn into fiction this story that was just not fiction, and how thinly veiled it was. And the question really reared up like, why? Why does this have to be fictionalized? And I came to understand, and this is not true for all writers, and I have great respect for fiction and fiction writers, but for me in this process, I couldn't excavate the truths that were packed into my own experience unless I did the work on them as me. They really, because there was so much trauma, like to truly see myself in that illness experience, especially as a young person, I would write a draft and people would be like, I'm not sure this part is totally honest. Like, is that really what was happening there? Or like, can you say more about your relationship in this way? Or can you say more about your relationship with your parents? And so those questions then force the reckoning, force the like, do I really understand that? How? Let me look at that. And that's really what gave me the understanding of the things I've lived through for them to be of use, right? So I knew, especially after that experience, that they would be nonfiction someday, but I had this day job and things were really messy. And one thing that happened was that I almost got fired from my day job at the sexual health clinic. I ended up getting diagnosed with ADHD at almost age 26. I was just having a lot of trouble with the parts of my job that were organizational and data-based. And I really had to reckon with like, it's not that I don't love public health and sexual health in particular, but like, I don't think I can do this forever. I don't think I can keep up with this job and not let people down. So what is the job that I'm built for? Common theme tonight, right? What am I built for? How do I honor that? How can that be of service? And it was like, well, I was always supposed to be a writer. And I knew if I went to a graduate program, I could at least get insurance for a few years. And at this point, the Affordable Care Act had passed, but it was not real yet, and it was still in litigation, and it was sort of like, is this gonna happen? So when I quit my day job to go to an MFA program, when I started the long process of applying and getting ready to leave, like all of that was a huge Hail Mary for me to sort of see if I could actually have this life that I conceived of, that I wanted so badly. And when I got there, I knew that I would write about these things, and I started turning in essays. And that's when people were like, whoa, this is way too much stuff to be in one essay. This is so complicated. And we had this workshop where like, there's no way I could have taken their suggestions to turn this essay into something that made sense. And a writer named Megan Kimball approached me at the end, and she was like, I just want you to know that I had the same type of workshop at the beginning of my program. And she said, it's because it's a book. It's because it can't be in one essay. And so there was sort of this like, yeah, that's true. So how do I start untangling the different pieces of it? And then when I took the shocks to the heart and really began the supply chain inquiry, everything snapped into place. And it was like, I think this is the frame that I want to write this from. So it really built in steps. There's that like magnetic feeling in my breastbone that led me forward into the right next step. But it's easy to forget when you come to the finish line of something like this, it's easy to forget how uncertain every single step was.
Well, yeah, and to have a story, a real life story that is too unbelievable for your professors, that just shows is pretty astounding.
I was just telling my parents during dinner, I was on the podcast Science for the People, and the interviewer was a Canadian who lives in the UK. And she was like, I'm really sorry, I hope this isn't offensive, but I started reading your book and was like, I just don't even believe this. And I was like, I mean, it's real. And she's like, I know it's real, but like, I cannot conceive of that type of medical experience as a Canadian living in Britain, because like, just what? Like, there's just a lot there to unpack.
Yeah, and we have a lot of comments, and people said that they are writers and that you do inspire them. And is it okay? Somebody did ask, is it okay to ask, do you have your implant now?
I do.
Is that okay to talk about that?
Yeah, I do. I would like it out, is the short answer. My care has not really progressed much since the end of the book in 2017. One of the things that delayed my finishing of the book was that I had this stubborn idea that I needed the device out of my body, or in some way resolved, right? Those who've read it know that I end up with another part stuck in my body, and that also is in my body at this moment. And so I basically spent a lot of time trying to fight to get back to the Mayo Clinic, where I had specialists who I trusted. And I never was able to get back there because of the way our healthcare system works. So that felt very, very raw when the book first came out. And talking about that in public repeatedly was actually much harder for me than I thought. One of the beautiful things about having the book out is that my doctors at Mayo Clinic have gotten in touch with me. So I got to do an event with Dr. Ackerman, he's just like the sweetest human on the planet. If you want to watch it, the organization SADS, Sudden Arrhythmia Death Syndromes Foundation, they keep an archive of all they're like these live series on their Facebook page. And then my Dr. Ray, he reached out and he read it the first weekend it came out. He saw it in the New York Times and he said, I think it's a truly great book, and I'm going to be giving it to patients. And he said, if you need something, we have our ways. So my mom likes to say, like, okay, now he needs to not retire because he's not like the springiest of spring chickens. He's in great shape, but yeah, there's sort of this question that's just dangling out there in the same way it was at the end of the book. And I think that's why the book ends where it does, because in some way, we never resolve the question of our proximity to death, period. Any of us ever, that's part of the human condition. And for me, it's still a lived part of my experience, even though I get to fall asleep to it a little bit more often. And being on book tour really like woke me up to it in kind of a tough way. So I, at this point, remain not very afraid of long QT syndrome. I remain very dedicated to my drugs to avoid list. I remain very aware of how lifestyle choices impact my heart. And I'm less worried about that condition than I am about both the technology and its potential backfires and baggage, but also the way it hooks me to a medical system that brutalizes me. And in the past few months, I've had to try to get appointments for other things, and no one is accepting new patients. Or I did actually meet with a great new cardiologist, and my EKG cost $228 out of pocket because even though I have insurance, it has a $1,500 deductible. And, you know, it's easy if you work in certain careers for $228 to be like, whatever. But until just a few days ago, I had a cocktail bartending job. And if I worked an entire 8.5-hour shift with tips, I would be lucky to make post-tax $228 to pay this bill. And so those costs on my body, that's just an EKG. That's just checking in on the electricity of my heart and making sure my device is working. And that does not go without weight. So yeah, I remain hopeful that at some point I may no longer be a cyborg. The book helped connect me to some people who have had their technology taken out, which was not a peer group I previously had. And I really am just waiting to see, probably like when I need a valve replacement is when some of this might go down. I have about 5 years of battery life left on my IC.
So once again, it's just this constant, but like you said, that is life in general. Going to the post office, it could be device going off, or it could be something else. So other people someone else was asking about the creative process, and I did want to point out we are having this wonderful workshop with you on Saturday that is full, unfortunately, but we're hoping to have more of those. But certainly, we're looking forward to that. Someone else mentioned that they think this should be required reading for medical school, public health, and policy-driven degrees. Tell me how you feel about that.
That would be the goal. So thank you to whoever said that. Yeah, the question of like, who's your audience was really scary for me, because on the one hand, I hope it's a good enough narrative, just like a human story, that anyone with a body, whether or not they've already experienced illness or disability, can kind of come along on that. And I really had never been connected to other people like myself who had these conditions, or who I knew other people who'd been sort of burned by the medical system, but they usually had pretty different circumstances happening. And so to meet other people with long QT syndrome specifically, ICDs especially, but also other heart conditions, that's been stunning. And yet, like, if I'm honest, it means the most when I hear from doctors for whom it resonates. I think because I had such wounding around different doctors just really responding to me as though I was hysterical, that I didn't know what I was talking about, or I should just be able to move through these experiences sort of without emotions or trauma or questions, or and I will tell you, early on, there was a doctor in Austin who bought 40 copies for his whole practice. He ordered them from my local bookstore, which was really struggling at the time, and he probably helped save that bookstore. He handed them out to the device rep and the admin assistant. I mean, it was really beautiful. And I have been hearing from like Harvard Medical School's cardiology, who this doctor texted his trainees immediately and said, you have to read this. So how that ends up trickling out, how people end up with books in their hands, whether or not they bring me in for a speaker series and I gain a larger reach, sort of remains to be seen. I have like certain medical ethics seminars, like nibbling, but not all established yet. And so this is one place that if anyone in the audience wants to gift a book to a medical practitioner, that would be really beautiful and really meaningful to me. But also, if you have connections at medical schools or policy departments, a lot of this doesn't happen by magic. It happens through people like really reaching out to say, like, this book is amazing, this book is important, please like check this out.
Yeah, so it can make a difference not only in an individual patient, but also just in the practice in general, and maybe even bigger in terms of our, health, because you do point out so many flaws in the system. Even a questioner asked on the chat, did you ever consider leaving the country for your medical care, to get free medical care?
I did. That was one of the things we talked about with my parents when we were brainstorming. And I think ultimately back then, there just was too little familiarity with what that would be and how that would work. And, in the middle of all the other uncertainty, that felt scarier. Now, knowing what I know, there are lots of countries with really beautiful healthcare systems who can offer some of these services much cheaper. And I definitely, if anyone knows of like a really smart, kind, I don't know, Danish man or Spanish man, I have definitely visited countries that have good healthcare systems and been like, how do you do this? Like, how do I go there? And yet, even as I say that, like, just look at me, I'm in love with the American West. And so it's really a deep wound to know that the place that I love, the place that is really my home, just makes it so hard for us to get the care that we need.
Yeah, and you address in the book so much. Your family obviously was so supportive of you, but it's not easy for people to lift up their life and travel across the country and financially help out. And yet you guys managed to do it, but there's people you talk a lot about that what about the people that don't have any options whatsoever to travel and to find the care they need?
I just yesterday at this signing in Denver met this man who I've been connected to on social media for a while. His doctor was actually also Dr. Oza, which is part of why he reached out to say hi to me. He was like, my doctor's in this book. And like we're kind of a small crew of people. So I loved that he got in touch, and I loved that he came to meet me yesterday. And we were talking about the project I refer to in the epilogue, My Heart, Your Heart, which is run by Dr. Thomas Crawford out of the Detroit area. That's the organization that collects used pacemakers and tests their battery levels and makes sure the electronics are good. And then they clean them appropriately and reprogram them and send them to other countries to be implanted, or take them there because it's illegal to actually send them. And Tom Crawford implanted the first pacemaker in Sierra Leone just within the last few years. And if you're not familiar with Sierra Leone, that's a West African country. It's actually strangely a place that I have been twice and a place that I really love. And so to hear about Tom performing that surgery, I just really kept thinking about, like, what does it mean to be a human who has a heart condition, who gets lucky and has this device implanted in them that no one else in their world is able to access, even at greatly reduced rates, several $100s for the wires and several $100s for the device, sometimes thousands for a defibrillator. That's beyond what someone in a country like Sierra Leone can sort of cobble together from their networks of friends. But then you implant it, and what? You go home potentially to a village where there's not electricity. Maybe you have to walk home because people do not have access to vehicles. It's just such a different context of care. And really, for me, create some interesting tensions around, like, what does it mean to have access to this technology? And what is it that goes with the technology in different places that is kind of invisible to us?
Yeah, those are big questions. A fun question. Someone wants to know, do you write by hand? Do you write on the computer? Do you type?
Great question. I write mostly by hand for my initial drafts. And then I often type it in, and I'll usually drive it forward on the computer. And then I'll usually print it out and sort of revise on top of it and then type it back in. And so when I was working with like big stacks of pages, there's a real problem for authors where, like, a painter can go close in and then also step back from their painting. And for authors, we're sort of like scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, trying to get a sense. So many times I would print out the whole big chunk and, sometimes literally spread pages out, but sometimes just try to feel how much is happening in how much space. And so I am not as good a journaler anymore now that our lives are so much technological, and I do not like that. It's not good for me. But that initial habit is important to me because I often will just erase everything I write. If I start in a document, the perfectionist impulse is very big. And usually important things that I should be writing begin as some kind of inspiration, which are often like, I have my journal with me type scenarios. And with research, I'm often sort of like scribbling ideas out of order, actually like all over a page or all over a whiteboard. Research, I will sometimes go through a book and go through an article and just put all the relevant quotes in a document. And then I sort of like grow the document until it is like both quotes and some prose around the quote. So that stuff I will do kind of on computer first, but I'm usually holding the physical book while I do that. So I'm very much an advocate for like physical, tactile, really like the eros of the objects of writing is so much of the love for me.
It seems to suit what we know about you through your book. So many people with this book, like you said, on so many levels. And so tell us about teaching and what you're doing now as we start to close up here, and how you're reaching out to people in that way.
Yeah, I do a lot of things. So beyond sort of the speaking gigs associated with this book, I am a very part-time professor at Ashland University's low residency MFA, which stands for Master of Fine Arts. That's the terminal degree for creative writing. And a low residency program means the writers work with us remotely during the semester and then more intensively every summer for a few weeks. And so this actually starts on Sunday. It'll be virtual again this year because we just didn't know how to plan and didn't want to put anyone who might be immune compromised in a tough situation in terms of attending their program or protecting their health. But yeah, that program has me looking at writers' work, and there are actually a lot of public events coming up associated with that. If you follow me on social media, you'll be hearing about them. I'm teaching a little free workshop called Writing About Real People, and I'm teaching a little free workshop about pacing writing through syntax, which means sentence level and paragraph level choices. And then I'm also going to be doing a panel with my agent and editors, which I'm actually a little nervous about to hear what they have to say. But the question is sort of like, how does a book like Lightning Flowers come to be? And so that's a pretty interesting one for folks who are trying to build a writing life. And then there will be readings every night from the faculty. I also run my own business, which is partially hosted by me in either my private Zoom room or previous to COVID, in person, usually in weekend intensives. I teach sex writing, illness writing, and trauma writing. And I'm just really interested in what it takes to tell these difficult and important stories of the body, as you can see from the book. And my classes really focus on 4 elements. One of them is, what are the physiological hurdles to telling these stories? So what are the ways trauma shows up in the body and maybe keeps us silenced? Or we try to push through it and we really do ourselves more harm than good. Also, what are the craft challenges to telling this type of story? So what do we do with fragmented memories when we literally don't have access to all the pieces? How do you arrange those on the page? How do you make them still compelling? Or something like repeated doctor's visits, which are very boring on the page often, and also very important to some of these stories. So how do you handle that? So craft challenges, yeah, what tools do we have to work with the storytelling so that things that might be hard to capture on the page actually are captivating to readers? And then the social barriers. So what are the ways we've been taught to think about our stories that change the telling of the story? And is that the story we need to tell? And is there a braver or truer version available to us? And so sort of isolating cultural messages or social situations that have impacted us. And then the last piece is once you deal with all of those, often you have some kind of invitation shoot, I really need to be in trauma therapy. I really need to work with a body practitioner around my trauma in order to write this piece. Or I really need to have some conversations with people in my life because what I've always thought I couldn't do, I actually can do and I will do, but it's going to change my relationship to these people. By writing this, I'm going to really shake some things up. And a lot of people have fears about that. So the last part of what I really do is what are the spiritual invitations to telling a certain story? How do we get invited into a different version of ourselves? And usually sort of a bigger, fuller, braver version of ourselves, but through a scary process. And I teach those classes, at literary centers around the country, and then also in my own rented spaces. And we'll see how that changes with what's going on with COVID and what people feel like.
Yeah, I've read many of your essays online, and you're such a compelling writer. Everything just is terrific. I'm not just saying it's wonderful writing, but also then how can we reach you? How can we, obviously we have books at the library. We purchased quite a few, couple dozen books for this event, so people can put those on hold or check those out. You can purchase them. Kati supports small locally owned bookstores. We have the bookstall in Wilmette, I believe. And so how can we reach you? Tell us about your website and social media, and how can we find more of you?
Yeah, so we made sure that the book bin in Northbrook and also the bookstall in Winnetka, they both have copies of Lightning Flowers, and I'm going there tomorrow to sign them. So if you just want a generic signature in those, you can get them there. And you can also come by if you already have a copy of the book and you want it signed more personally. I'm going to be signing at First United Methodist Church of Arlington Heights, which is, I believe, on Euclid. And that will happen on Sunday from 10:30 a.m. to noon. and anyone is welcome. I'll be right inside the main entrance of the church on the west side. Bring your own book, and we will get them signed. And we may have a few if you don't have a book yet, but it's really, really wonderful if you support those local bookstores, because that's sort of how those bookstores know that this book is important, and that they should keep stocking it and like put it out on the tables. So people can also reach me on my website at katherinestandefer.com. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Girl Makes Fire, and I have a Facebook author page at Katherine E. Standefer. And yeah, just come to some other events or track me down for one of the classes I'm teaching. Since a lot of them are online right now, you can take them even if you're not in the same location. And I also have a Patreon, which is a way that readers can directly support authors to make sure that they are compensated for their long, winding writing process, very little of which is, of course, financially compensated. So, and then you get little love letters from me occasionally in thanks, telling you about my writing process and what's going on behind the scenes.
Okay.
So all of that and more.
Well, we just loved having you here, and the fact that you happened to be in town and you could be here in our studios was even more beneficial, since I think Wi-Fi on the Mesa in New Mexico might be a little tricky.
You know, it's usually pretty good, but it's been bad the last week, so I'm really grateful to be here. It's less good when it rains, which is charming. I think my Wi-Fi is good because we've been in a drought.
Right. But we've really enjoyed this. It's just great that you're, we like to support, obviously you're from the local area, and you're now a little celebrity amongst us. And Thank you. And truly, you know, folks who love the book, I think there's a lot of misconception about like the difference between how things look on the outside and what it actually takes to have a writing career. So if you did love the book, please go on whatever engine you purchased it from and leave a review. Whether you just tell your local bookseller that you adore it, encourage them to bring me in for an event if I haven't done an event with them, rate it on Amazon, even though I personally don't love Amazon, but those reviews really matter. Goodreads, Barnes & Noble, post about it on social media. These things are total gifts to authors, and a lot of them are free to do. And I'm just so grateful. I've been so moved from all the ways people are reaching out to me on social media and through email. And like, thank you truly to everyone who has so thoughtfully given their time to read this book and to talk about it with other people. And last thing, I'm trying to meet with 100 book clubs, and I'm at, I think, 26. So feel free to hop on my website and shoot me an email if you want to convene a group of people and talk about the book together. That's great. That's a lot of fun too.
That's amazing. Your thank yous were way better than what I had prepared, so I hate to even just follow you up. Thank you. Yeah, unfortunately, I have to be the bearer of bad news and say that the program is over. But thank you everyone for coming out tonight. You are the reason why we do these programs, so we greatly appreciate your participation in this. Your questions were amazing. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them. I read all of them. They were great. Some of the stories were just, you know, so touching. So thank you for sharing those. Thank you to both my colleagues, Joan and Natalie, for being here tonight. And of course, thank you to the wonderful Katherine Standefer for being so generous with your time and sharing your behind the writing stories. They're great. And just having you here is just, I have no words, clearly. But to everyone who came, as I mentioned before, once you leave this program, you will be directed to a survey, and we greatly appreciate any and all feedback that you give us. It does affect the program calendar for the future. We do read all of those, so anything that you can tell us would be wonderful. And I guess with that, that is the end of tonight, and we will see you all in a future program. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.